Hi, everybody. Welcome. Today we are going to be talking about adaptations to aerobic training as it relates to cardiorespiratory endurance. So when we think about cardiorespiratory endurance and what that means, again, we're looking at the maximal ability for us to utilize the aerobic pathways. So understanding kind of the maximal ability of our cardiovascular or cardiorespiratory system to be able to sustain maximal intensity of work. When we think about how that applies to our athletes, again, we're interested in what we would call endurance training or cardio training. So again, thinking about the application of that endurance training in order for us to improve their cardiorespiratory endurance. So here we can see the relationship between VO2 max and running speed here. And you can see that pre-training is labeled here in blue and red represents post-training. So essentially we believe that we can improve VO2 max with chronic training over the course of about 8 weeks by up to 25%. So we can experience substantial improvements in VO2 max, which is huge. Again, when we're thinking about how this applies to us as coaches, what this tells us is we can help our athletes to improve their efficiency from an endurance perspective by 25%. So again, you can see that VO2 max, or the maximal amount of oxygen that we can consume in any given minute, is a pretty strong predictor of endurance performance in sport. So when we're working with athletes that are participating in those types of events or those types of sports, it's really important for us to sell to them that we can improve these variables through chronic and well-organized training. So when we think about what are the adaptations to regular chronic aerobic training, there are major changes that are going to occur within the cardiovascular system. Okay, so number one will be heart size. We are able to increase heart size by approximately 25% for our trained endurance athletes. And we will do that in kind of two ways. Number one is we want to increase the size of the heart chamber itself, which means that it's going to allow us to bring more blood into the heart in any given cardiac cycle. The other thing that we'll do as it relates to heart size is we'll increase the thickness of those heart walls. And by increasing the thickness of those heart walls, it increases the strength of that muscle, which will allow us to create more forceful contractions each time we send the blood out of the heart. Okay. Additionally, we will see changes in stroke volume as well. And again, stroke volume is the amount of blood that we're going to send out in any given contraction. And we'll see this increase at rest, during submaximal, and during maximal exercise for our well-trained endurance athletes. When we think about heart rate and what's happening with heart rate will actually do it. This is a little interesting. So at rest, heart rate will decrease. Okay. And the reason for that is because you've created a stronger heart muscle, right? So the stronger the heart muscle, the less beats I need in order for me to deliver blood flow. Okay. We'll also see a decrease in heart rate at a submaximal level. So for example, if I was a runner or let's say I was untrained and I go out to the track and I can run 1 mile in 8 minutes. Okay, so I can run an 8-minute mile and maybe my heart rate then is 150 beats per minute. Okay, let's say I start training and I'm running quite a bit and I'm running, most days of the week, and I'm doing that over the course of 8 weeks, and I go back out to the track and now I run that same pace for 1 mile. So I run an 8-minute mile. At this point, my heart rate will be substantially lower. So maybe now it's down to 135 or something along those lines. So at that same absolute intensity, I'm able to decrease my heart rate because that workload is a little bit easier. Okay. When we think about heart rate at the maximal level during maximal exercise, heart rate will not change necessarily with training. However, we are able to do more work before we reach maximal heart rate with regular chronic training. Okay, so we think about cardiac output. Cardiac output will not be changed at rest for our chronically trained athletes. However, the mechanism by which it stays the same actually changes, if that makes sense. So cardiac output is the product of heart rate and stroke volume. So I take heart rate. Oh, red wasn't a great choice. Let's try white. So I can take heart rate times stroke volume This is when I wish I had a touchscreen computer. So if my heart rate decreases at rest and my stroke volume increases at rest, this allows my cardiac output to remain the same, even though both of those variables have actually changed. Okay, submaximal exercise, same. It will stay the same for that submaximal intensity. And when we get to maximal exercise, cardiac output will increase substantially. And that's going to be primarily due to that increase in stroke volume we experience due to the increase in like the muscle mass on the heart. Okay, when we think about blood flow with chronic endurance training, we are better able to send blood to areas of high need. So we're better able to shunt blood away from like the digestive system and better able to send that blood to the muscles that we're utilizing. Okay. When we think about blood pressure, again, if we're working with individuals that have high blood pressure, regular endurance training could allow them to get down into the normal healthy ranges. However, for regular healthy individuals who already have a a normal blood pressure to start, we won't experience any changes, either positive or negative, with blood pressure with chronic training. Okay, when we think about blood volume, we'll see a substantial increase in blood volume over time, up to about 10 to 15% increase in blood volume with chronic training. And this will come from a mix of both plasma and red blood cells. So we will increase both of these variables. The plasma, which is like the watery portion of the blood, it's great to increase this because then we have more fluid in the body, and so therefore we have a greater capacity to sweat and get rid of heat that way. The increase in red blood cells is also great because that's going to increase our ability to deliver oxygen and to the skeletal muscle. Okay, so let's dive in. Okay, so oxygen transport system and the Fick equation. Okay, and heart size. So again, oxygen transport systems and the Fick equation has to do with our ability to deliver oxygen as it relates to cardiac output, total peripheral resistance, and AVO2 difference. Okay, we talked a little bit about this in our acute section on cardiorespiratory fitness, but essentially with chronic training, we are able to improve our oxygen transport system because this is a limiting factor for us during maximal exercise. As we mentioned, heart size will increase by up to 25% through both an increase in the strength of the muscle or the thickness of the muscle, as well as an increase in the enlargement of the chamber itself. Okay. So again, we said stroke volume will increase substantially after training. So we mentioned that would be a factor that we would see both at rest, during submaximal, and during maximal exercise. However, these stroke volume adaptations to training will decrease with age. Again, as people age, we generally see a decrease in muscle mass kind of across the board. So not only with skeletal muscle, but also with that heart muscle as well. So again, we'll see that probably after the age of 35 or so is when we kind of start to see that decline in muscle mass if individuals aren't really, being diligent about pushing themselves to stress the muscle so that therefore they can at least maintain, if not improve, the muscle mass that they have. Okay. So again, as we mentioned, resting heart rate will decrease with chronic training. Okay, we're going to decrease resting heart rate because stroke volume increases, and that increase in stroke volume is going to allow us to send more blood per contraction, and so therefore we have the ability to decrease the number of contractions. Okay. At submaximal exercise, we said heart rate would also be decreased. And again, if we're matching the absolute intensity, that's going to be true, right? So I gave the example of if I run at an 8-minute mile when I am untrained, my heart rate might be 150. And if I run an 8-minute mile as a trained person, my heart rate might be more like 135 or something along those lines. Okay. Again, as mentioned, maximal heart rate will not change. So maximal heart rate will be pretty much maintained regardless of training status or training level. Okay, so again, maximal heart rate will not necessarily be affected by training. All right, now what do we got here? Cardiovascular changes to talk about. Heart rate recovery. Okay. So again, as individuals become more fit, their heart rate recovery will improve. Okay. So again, when we're talking about heart rate recovery, we're talking about how much time does it take after an exercise bout for us to return to our resting heart rate. Okay. So at a submaximal intensity, right, we're able to increase heart rate to, let's say, 150 or whatever, and within 8 minutes or 10 minutes we're able to return back to our resting level. Okay. The more fit you are, the faster that recovery occurs. So again, if I were doing exercise where I had that heart rate at a submaximal level, maybe instead of 10 minutes, maybe it's only 4 minutes before I'm back to that resting level. And again, that just indicates that we're recovering a lot faster when we're more trained, because again, we're kind of used to being under stress and being away from homeostasis. So your body is more attuned to be able to return us back to that homeostasis. Okay. Cardiac output, again, we said at rest and during submaximal exercise, this is not affected by training. However, the mechanism by which we're delivering the blood is changing. Okay, so cardiac output at rest will experience a decrease in heart rate, but an increase in stroke volume. However, cardiac output stays the same. Submaximal exercise, same gig. We'll see an increase in stroke volume, a decrease in heart rate, but cardiac output remains similar to what we would experience at an untrained status. And when we look at cardiac output during maximal exercise, we'll see an increase. And the major reason for that is we're going to see a substantial increase in stroke volume, but max heart rate stays the same. And so those two factors together are what are going to allow us to see that increase in cardiac output. Again, please make note that the reason that cardiac output is increased at that maximal level is directly linked to that change in stroke volume. Okay. So we mentioned that we're going to experience some blood flow change with chronic exercise as well. So we're going to see an increase in blood flow to active muscle tissue. Okay. So for example, if I'm cycling, I'm going to see vasodilation in my leg muscles, and that's going to allow me to deliver more oxygen and nutrients to my legs. Additionally, with chronic training, we are able to increase capillary density. Okay, so capillaries, again, are the blood vessels that are going to facilitate exchange. So again, they're going to drop off nutrients, they're going to allow us to pick up waste products, and these are going to be increased. So we're going to have more little roads for us to deliver oxygen and nutrients. Additionally, with training, we're able to recruit more of the capillaries that we have. So we're able to recruit more of these roads. Some of the roads that are maybe less traveled will become more traveled, I guess, with chronic training, and that's going to allow us to, again, enhance our ability to deliver blood. We'll also be better at shunting blood away from inactive areas. Okay, so again, if I'm cycling, I don't necessarily need a whole lot of blood in my upper extremity, and I certainly don't need blood in my digestive organs. Okay, so I'm going to kind of close off blood flow to those particular areas, and I'm just going to be more efficient about sending the blood to the muscle mass that is activated. Okay. As we mentioned, an increase in total blood volume will also benefit us in this perspective because we have more blood to send to active tissue. And certainly as we create more vessels, as described by this increase in capillary density, it is important that we have enough blood. So we're also going to concurrently increase blood volume so that we're able to match those two things. Okay. So if I have more roads, I need more buses on my roads in order for those roads to have a purpose. And so this increase in blood volume goes kind of right hand in hand with this increase in capillary density. Okay. As we mentioned with blood pressure, again, for a healthy, untrained adult who has normal blood pressure levels, we won't necessarily experience any changes in resting blood pressure. Okay. If I were hypertensive or I had somebody that was hypertensive that I was working with, somebody that had high blood pressure, regular chronic exercise can allow them to reduce their cholesterol or their blood pressure levels. However, in athletics, that would be pretty rare for us to have hypertensive athletes, but certainly not impossible. So again, that could be certainly a benefit of them participating in sport. as it relates to blood volume and this change, again, we're going to have an increase in blood volume. And again, in order for us to kind of accommodate that from a blood pressure perspective, it's important that we also vasodilate our vessels and build some of those capillaries that we talked about, so we have locations for that blood to be delivered. Okay, this is kind of cool. This shows you two images. Let me get my little laser here. Oops. Where we're looking at blood volume pre-training and post-training. Okay, so here you can see total blood volume is 5 liters, and with regular training, we're able to increase this to 5.7 liters. Now, notice that the hemo concentration or hematocrit, which is equivalent to, sorry, a bug just flew at me, which is equivalent to the percentage of blood that's made up of red blood cells. So a normal person at rest is about 44% of our blood is coming from the red blood cells. Okay, but notice the absolute values. Okay, so I had 2.2 liters of red blood cells before I trained. Then I increased that number to 2.4 liters post-training. However, the hematocrit actually decreased. Okay, and the reason for that is we saw a total increase in total blood volume. Okay, so we experience increases in both plasma volume and total red blood cell volume. However, it is the plasma volume increases that are more substantial in comparison to the red blood cell increases, which is why hematocrit actually decreases with training. Okay, so the blood becomes more fluidy. So it decreases its viscosity. It's not as thick because we have a greater percentage of it coming from this fluid portion. All right, so let's take a look at what's happening within the respiratory system. So as it relates to pulmonary ventilation, again, we'll experience some changes here. However, the changes to the respiratory system aren't as pronounced as what we see within the cardiovascular system. And the reason for that is because the cardiovascular system is really our limiter when we think about exercise performance from a cardiovascular perspective or from an aerobic perspective. So the pulmonary system will experience some changes, but not really that much. So pulmonary ventilation is equal to tidal volume times breathing frequency. With chronic training, we are going to probably see a minimal increase in tidal volume, and breathing frequency may be decreasing slightly at rest. However, our total ventilation shouldn't be necessarily changed at rest or during exercise for that matter. And the reason for that is the pulmonary ventilation isn't a limiter for us. We're getting plenty of air in. Our limitation within these two systems has to do with getting blood to the lungs so that we can deliver or so that we can pick up the oxygen from the lungs and put it into the blood. Okay, so pulmonary diffusion is a factor that we want to improve upon. Okay, so pulmonary diffusion has to do with the ability to move gases from the alveoli into the blood and move gas from the blood back into the alveoli. Okay, so again, we're able to improve this by increasing capillary density in the pulmonary regions of the body. Okay. When we think about AVO2 difference or arterial venous oxygen difference, essentially we're looking at the oxygen concentration differences from the arteries to the veins. And the higher this number is, that tells us that the greater the drop off of oxygen has been at the tissue level. Okay, so AVO2 difference basically tells us how much oxygen was delivered to that active tissue. So certainly during exercise, we're going to see an increase in AVO2 difference, and with chronic training, we'll also see an increase in AVO2 difference. And again, the reason isn't really related to the respiratory system. Again, because that's not a limiter for us. The reason that AVO2 difference is going to increase is because we're going to increase capillary density at the tissue level, and we're going to decrease what's known as the diffusible distance, or the distance from oxygen needing to travel from the capillary into the skeletal muscle. So that distance will decrease, therefore allowing us to deliver more oxygen at that tissue level. Okay, so again, AVO2 difference will increase due to oxygen extraction at that active muscle. Okay, so let's talk about the muscular changes associated with chronic endurance training. And first thing to kind of address is muscle fiber type. Okay, so again, we have these fast twitch, we have these intermediate, and we have these slow twitch fibers. Generally speaking, like you're born with a certain makeup of these fibers in terms of like if you have 50% fast, 50% slow, or whatever your kind of arrangement in it is. And again, that's genetic in nature. So again, whether you have a lot of fast twitch or slow twitch has a lot to do with if you chose your parents correctly or not. And so when we think about how these are modified or changed with training, we're able to do something called selective hypertrophy. And with selective hypertrophy, we're able to kind of increase the size of those slow twitch or those type 1 fibers. We're also able to kind of make the intermediate fibers more like the type 1 fibers. Okay. However, there isn't a chance that we can take our fast twitch fibers and turn them into aerobic fibers or slow twitch fibers. So that's not available to happen. We can certainly upregulate or increase the size of our slow twitch fibers. We can also make those intermediate fibers seem more like the slow twitch fibers if we train in that way. Okay. Again, some of this has to do with capillary supply. So this can be very specific to the muscle mass that you're activating. So I've given the example a few times now about cycling. And the reason that I think cycling is a good example is because I'm only really using my legs in that particular activity. So it really isolates the leg muscles. Okay. So when we think about capillary supply, we're able to increase capillary density in those muscles that we're going to be regularly activated with our training. Okay. We'll also enhance a molecule known as myoglobin. And myoglobin is a molecule that's going to carry oxygen from the edge of the cell into the mitochondria. And again, this is going to enhance our ability to do aerobic work if I have more myoglobin. So we'll increase myoglobin again, and this will only be specific in the muscle mass that I activate. So if I am a cyclist, I'm going to have a lot of myoglobin in my legs, but I might not have that much, or my myoglobin in my upper extremity might not look that different than somebody in comparison to somebody who is untrained. Okay, continuing on, talking about the muscles here. Again, we think about mitochondrial function within those specific muscle fibers or within those muscle cells. Um, we are going to increase the amount of mitochondria that we have and increase the enzymes that are found within each of these mitochondria as well. We're going to increase the oxidative enzymes, as I mentioned, that are found in the mitochondria. Okay, so again, think of these enzymes as like little factory workers within the factory. The more workers I have, the more aerobic work I can do, or the more things I can get done. And so by increasing these enzymes, I'm able to increase the speed at which I complete these metabolic pathways. Speaking of metabolism, let's take a look here at what happens. Okay, so when we think about RER or respiratory exchange ratio or our metabolic adaptations, RER is measured by looking at the amount of CO2 produced in comparison to the amount of oxygen consumed. Did I say that right? The amount of CO2 produced in comparison to the amount of oxygen consumed. And again, this ratio will give us information about the efficiency of the metabolic pathways, but it will also tell us what type of fuel we're using. So for individuals at rest, when they become highly trained, will tend to burn more fats. So they're going to have a lower RER. And as we move to submaximal exercise, again, that RER will remain lower because we are better fat burners, essentially, if we're doing kind of like true long duration endurance exercise. That will allow us to kind of do something called glycogen sparing, which allows us to kind of save our sugars for something of higher intensity. Okay. So when we think about how does this kind of apply from a VO2 perspective. And again, VO2 is kind of cool because it really ties together the work of both the cardiovascular and the pulmonary systems. Okay. So when we think about our resting VO2, how much oxygen do we need in any given minute? This number really isn't going to change unless this person experienced a substantial change in like muscle mass. Okay, so if they have an increase in muscle mass, that would cause an increase in VO2. However, if there's no change in muscle mass or no change in body size, then that resting VO2 will remain pretty comparable or pretty similar. Same thing with submaximal VO2, it's going to stay about the same because it's that submaximal level. However, when we become more trained, that same submaximal VO2 will feel significantly easier in comparison to before training. When we think about VO2 max and how that changes, we already talked about that, but VO2 max is going to increase substantially with training. That's one of our major goals. And again, as we mentioned, VO2 max, or a maximal ability to deliver and utilize oxygen, is a huge predictor of endurance success. Okay, let me get in here a little closer so I can read this. My screen's a little bit small here. This is kind of cool. So this kind of summarizes, and again, we've talked about quite a few of these factors throughout the course, but this kind of summarizes how VO2 max is going to increase with chronic regular training. Um, so again, let's start over here on the left side. So you can see the brain cardiovascular center here is going to be activated, which causes an activation of the sympathetic nervous system, and that's going to have multiple effects. But one of the effects is going to be an increase in norepinephrine, which is going to cause an increase in calcium, which causes an increase in contractility of the heart. Okay. And again, when I increase contractility, that's going to cause me to increase stroke volume, okay, because we're talking about what's happening within the heart here. And an increase in stroke volume is going to allow me to increase cardiac output. Higher cardiac output is going to allow me to increase VO2 max. Okay, let's take a look at other things. So within the brain, we activate that cardiovascular center. We increase sympathetic nervous activity. This causes us to modify where we're sending the blood. Okay, so when that sympathetic nervous system is activated, it'll cause constriction in certain areas and vasodilation in other areas. Okay, as I increase contractility of the heart muscle, it can cause hypertrophy or an increase in the heart that we talked about. So again, it'll be like an increase in the chamber size, but also an increase in the thickness of the heart walls. Okay, sort of independently, we see an increase in plasma volume as well. As I increase plasma volume, that can do something called increase in diastolic volume. So essentially what that is like how much blood is in the heart before the contraction occurs. Because I have more blood, I'm able to have more blood return to the heart. So that's going to increase in diastolic volume, which in turn causes an increase in the amount of blood that I can send out. Oh, let's check out what's over here. On this side, we've got autoregulation, that's myogenic, metabolic, and endothelium mediated. Again, that's going to help us to modify where we send that blood specifically. So again, particularly the endothelium mediated activation is like the release of nitric oxide, and nitric oxide is a local factor released as it relates to metabolic activity. And so as I increase metabolic activity, it increases the release of nitric oxide, and that causes those local vessels to vasodilate. Again, we talked about AVO2 difference being able to also increase. And again, here are some of the factors that would be associated with that increase in AVO2 difference, or the delivery of oxygen, the extraction at that tissue level. And that extraction at that tissue level is directly linked to that increase in VO2 max. So this chart is freaking cool because it shows the complexity of what we got going on in order for us to deliver oxygen and how we can become more efficient. There's so many different avenues here. Okay, so let's take a look at lactate threshold and how this is going to change. Okay, lactate threshold, again, we talked about this when we did our metabolic unit, is the point at which blood lactate accumulation kind of increases sharply. And with chronic endurance training, we're going to see this lactate threshold shift to the right, which means we can do more work before we reach this point. Okay, it's usually expressed as a percentage of VO2 max. So, as an untrained person, if my lactate threshold occurs at like 70%, for example, with chronic training, maybe I'm able to increase this to approximately 80%. Okay, so here you can see kind of what that lactate threshold looks like. And if the red is showing us before training, post training, we're going to see that lactate threshold shift to the right. So maybe instead of being at 12 kilometers per hour, this individual can make it to 14 miles per hour before they would hit this level. So again, a higher lactate threshold is good. This will allow us to have a better endurance performance because we're able to do more work before we start to build up waste products, which is a huge goal for us. Okay, so if two athletes had the same VO2 max, an individual with higher lactate threshold would have a better performance. So again, if their maximal capacity is the same, they could probably get away with that and probably be pretty equal still in like the mile, for example. So if we're looking at like 4 to 6 minutes, they might be able to get away with it with some other factors. But the longer the endurance event is, the more lactate threshold will play a role because you just can't sustain an exercise intensity once you're above that level. Once you start accumulating lactate, it's really, really difficult for you to continue at that same intensity. So here we're taking a look at what's going to happen with lactate threshold with chronic aerobic training. And the idea here is if we do a lot of training kind of right below the lactate threshold. So again, if lactate threshold is like, let's call it 85% intensity, if we can do a bunch of work at like 84% intensity, this is going to cause the lactate threshold to shift to the right. Okay, so again, essentially what we're looking at here is it's going to allow us to do more work before we begin to have that lactate buildup. Okay, so continuing to talk about some of these metabolic adaptations, one thing that I think is really important to note that is probably overlooked in the world of endurance training is this concept of long-term improvement. And again, in order for us to become really good at endurance sport or really good endurance athletes, it honestly, it takes weeks and weeks, months and months, and years of consistent training in order for us to see that needle move. And again, we think about, athletes that are at the high school level and athletes at the college level that are participating in endurance sport. That's a hard sell sometimes. It's a really hard sell, particularly if you're at a smaller school where these kids are multi-sport athletes or you just don't have that culture. It's really difficult to get a kid to buy into doing this consistent training year round but only competing X amount of times throughout the year. So again, it is really challenging for us to get kids to buy into that. And this is probably one of the reasons why in endurance sport, it is not uncommon to see athletes continue to progress throughout their lives. Like we're having women peak in their mid 30s. So these women have been competing or at least participating in chronic endurance exercise for 10, 15, 20 years. And again, all of that kind of builds together in order for them to kind of have this long-term improvement. Okay. Also, we can understand that there are certainly some individual differences in terms of how we respond to this type of training. And a lot of these individual responses will be dictated by whether or not the athlete is a high responder or a low responder. And again, we think about athletes that are high responders. These are individuals that genetically are set up for success in the endurance world. So again, when we think about what that athlete might be like in comparison to a low responder. Okay, so let's say I have two kids that come in, I coach high school level, and I have two kids that come in that are freshmen. And both of these boys, the beginning of their freshman year, can run 225 for the 800. Okay, so again, not really very good in my opinion for boys track and field for an 800-meter run. But let's say I put them on the exact same training plan. They're both doing all the workouts to the best of their ability. They both start at that same 225 mark. By the end of the season, athlete A is able to complete the 800 meters now in 2:13 or something along those lines. Like, wow, this person improved 12 seconds over the course of the program. That's great improvement. 2:12 is a very nice time for a freshman. Okay. The other athlete, athlete B, 2:25 was his starting time, and he did all the things that you asked him, did all the workouts to the best of his ability, along with his teammate. And at the end of the season, he was able to run 2:21. Again, are they both going to improve? Yes, everyone is going to improve with chronic, consistent, well-trained endurance programming. However, the extent to which they improve varies substantially based on genetics. Other factors that are going to be important to our response or our adaptation to training, certainly sleep, certainly nutrition are going to play an important role, right? What's going on between their ears, right? So again, we can think of that psychological element to success as well. So there are many factors that are going to play into how well an athlete responds to the program. Whether or not they believe in the program is another big factor, okay? If you have an athlete who has bought in and trusts you, that's huge, and they will improve to a greater extent than somebody who hasn't bought in, or somebody who doesn't necessarily trust you or doesn't believe that you know what you're talking about. So all those factors matter in terms of how quickly this athlete can improve. Okay. Other factors to kind of keep in mind when we talk about what's happening from a training perspective from these adaptations. So training status and pre-training VO2 max. So again, the more highly trained this individual is when they kind of start, the harder it is to move that needle, right? So again, the closer you already are to your like peak, the harder it is to continue to improve. Again, if I'm starting with somebody who's a beginner who hasn't really done this before, you look amazing because you're able to have them improve pretty quickly throughout a program. Again, pre-training VO2 max kind of goes right along with this training status effect. Okay, so again, if I have a high VO2 max to start with, I'm already close to my peak. So it's going to be much more difficult for us to see that needle move in comparison to somebody who's really detrained or has a low VO2 max to kind of start with. They'll be able to see more substantial growth or more substantial change. Okay, as we mentioned, heredity is huge in sport, and I think that this can be really frustrating for athletes, right? So again, I think that we enter life thinking that things are going to be fair, things are going to be equal, and if I work hard, logically speaking, I believe that I can do whatever it is I set my mind to. And to an extent, this is true, right? But we know as coaches that it doesn't always work out that way. Your hardest worker isn't always your best athlete. Do we prefer that? Yeah, we would prefer our hardest worker to be our best athlete, but there are certainly going to be talented kids that aren't going to have to work as hard. So again, you think about heredity and what is our role as a coach. Again, I don't believe our role as a coach is to win every single game or win every single match or win every single race. But it's about getting the most out of each athlete, wherever that potential is for them, wherever their ceiling is, let's get them there. And their ceiling is going to be limited or in part determined by heredity. Okay, so what are the genes that they were given, and how does that set them up for success or less success as an endurance athlete? One thing I forgot to mention with heredity that I think is important is heredity can determine somewhere between 15 to 25% of the variance in VO2 max. Okay, so again, at least approximately a quarter of your success as an endurance athlete will be in part determined by genetics. Okay. So again, we think about these gender differences as it relates to adaptations. Both men and women are going to be able to improve at a fairly equivalent rate. So again, we can see these adaptations occurring equivalently across the genders relative to their starting point. And again, men might be at that advantage because of testosterone and their ability to produce more hemoglobin and therefore carry more oxygen. Okay. We kind of already talked about this, the high versus low responders, and from a genetic perspective, who's going to be set up for more success than the other. So let's take a look at fatigue across sports. So adaptations to aerobic training in this regard. So again, endurance training is really important for endurance based events. That kind of makes sense. But again, thinking about the elements of each sport and kind of which of these sports or activities are going to require us to have a good endurance base. And again, a lot of them are. So for example, basketball, soccer, wrestling, all have a heavy amount of aerobic work kind of embedded in them. And so when we think about like developing an athlete, again, this is depends on which level of athletics you're working at, but I think it's really important that we think about how can these different sports contribute to each other, right? How do we build an athlete that contains all of these elements in differing proportions that contribute to success in a variety of sports? So again, we know that this endurance training is going to be critical for many different sports. Again, endurance training, is this important for non-endurance sports as well? Yeah, we think so. I mean, so a sport like softball, for example, or football aren't going to be heavily reliant on the endurance aspect in their sport, but will endurance training help these athletes? And the answer is yes. And there's lots of reasons for this. Again, I would say the top couple reasons that come to my mind are number one, weight management, right? So again, if we're doing a lot of endurance training, just burning calories and allowing these athletes to maintain body composition is really important. We can think about the importance of building mental toughness as well. Nobody wants to run, so again, giving kids these opportunities to do endurance sport exposes them to some things that are hard and some things that are uncomfortable. And so again, for those few reasons, endurance training is really good for those non-endurance based sports as well. Again, all athletes can benefit from maximizing cardiorespiratory endurance. So again, we believe that cardiorespiratory endurance is not only kind of the basis for sport performance, but also the basis for general health and wellness, right? So again, a lot of the research is showing that there's a direct relationship between cardiorespiratory endurance and longevity. The more fit you are from a cardiovascular perspective, the longer you get to live. So again, it's a great habit to establish in our athletes for so many reasons.